Well, thanks a lot for inviting us to this beautiful city, in a beautiful place. This is joint work with Sven Damen at Antwerp and Simon Nieuwburg at Columbia University. And the question we ask in alpha, just for those who are not in finance, an alpha is sort of return you cannot explain. So you can think of, if there's an alpha in affordable housing, the landlord earns a lot, which implicitly means the tenant also pays a lot, right? So the goal of this question is, I think, to zoom out. It goes much further than rent control. And the question is actually, I have in mind, is very simple. Can affordable housing be privately provided? Like, do markets actually, do they function? And do we actually see that properties that are affordable, which I mean, it has a low market rental value, so they're not below market rate, but they're just fundamentally cheap, are they actually offered at reasonable prices and returns? Maybe investors do not want to invest in affordable housing because they think it's too risky, or maybe there's frictions that prevent them from entering this market, which actually leads tenants to pay too much. That's what we're really after in this paper. And the problem is there has been extremely limited evidence on investing in low-tier rental housing by private parties. And we do that with a multi-country perspective. And I'm going to give you the main findings now so I can speed up and sort of spend a little bit more time on the rent control stuff we do in this paper, which is a small part of the paper, but maybe interesting for this conference. The key thing we find is we sort in all countries, the United States, Belgium, and the Netherlands, properties in deciles. So we go from the bottom 10% of properties by rental value. This is net of cost, this is gross, to the top 10%. And what you see both in the United States and in Belgium and in the Netherlands, that the returns to investing are highest in the cheapest units. And what we're going to ask is sort of why this is the case. And this holds both if you include the capital gain, so that house prices grow over time, but also if you just look at the cash flow, so the rent minus all the costs divided by the purchase price. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to look, why is this the case? Because in finance, what people say, well, this must be risky. And so we look at systematic risk, the idea that maybe if the economy is bad, low-tier rental housing also is not doing badly, and you're compensated for that. That's like a traditional finance way of explaining higher returns. The other thing that I will spend most attention to is sort of risk of regulation, and rent control clearly is one. And the other thing you can think of is idiosyncratic risk, which means like if you have a lot of small landlords, and in low tiers you have maybe more complicated tenants who are more likely to not pay the rent, or you have more hassle with them. And if you only own a few units and one of them is a tenant that provides you headache, well, then you want to be compensated and make more money, right? We say this cannot fully explain it. What is the alternative? We're going to propose limits to arbitrage. Probably I won't have a lot of time to go into detail on that. But there's three frictions. Friction number one, people that are poor, and live in low-tier rental housing, they typically cannot buy. So they have no alternative. They cannot afford a more expensive unit and they cannot buy. Right? So they could potentially be exploited because they have no alternative. The other thing is the landlords that are in this low tier, they tend to be super local and they have a hard time scaling up because I think of access to capital. And actually the very big institutional landlords that get a lot of attention, they tend to not invest in this segment, possibly for reputational reason or because it's very difficult to do this at a large scale. I think the key thing what we do is just measuring returns. That has been very difficult in the literature. I think so far there have been papers, including some of mine, just measuring what is the return. We now try to explain why are some returns higher than others. And I think a lot of some of the papers you might know here, for those that are in economics, there's a lot of paper on rental affordability and housing policy. And what we say, well, the fact that rental markets are so segmented is a reason for unaffordability and could be a motivation for public investments in housing, could be a motivation to provide subsidies. You could even think that sort of gives some room to rent control. I think that's up to the reader, but that's what we contribute to. We do 3 countries, the US, Belgium, and the Netherlands. They are very different. The US, big market, a lot of difference across states, not so regulated. Belgium is actually, I think, one of the most unregulated countries in Europe in terms of rental protection. It has mostly small investors, not big ones. The Netherlands is very regulated. It has a massive public housing sector, and it has big and small investors. So these are very different contexts. And despite the context being so different, we find the same, which we think is that this is something general. The other thing, and that's what I'm going to show you on the next slide, actually, every country to make all these claims, we need a lot of data. And sometimes the data in the US is not so good, but the data in Belgium is, so we can sort of leverage the relative strength. In the United States, we have data from all multifamily loans that are available in regular data sets. So any building, any flat in the United States is typically sort of bought with a mortgage by the investor. These mortgages, when you take them out, they measure what is the net operating income, so the rent minus the expenses, either appraised or actual if it's a property that already exists. And obviously they measure the sales price on the value, which gives us a measure of the net rent divided by the sales price. So that's great about the US because this is net of all expenses, and measuring expenses is very difficult. In Belgium and the Netherlands, we have to estimate expenses. For the sake of time, I won't tell you how we do it exactly, but we have a lot of detailed data to actually get very close, and some we can observe. What is great about Belgium? Belgium has a rent registry. We have all rental contracts, all sales prices of the entire country. What is great about the Netherlands, we have extremely detailed data on the tenants and the investors. So for every property, we know who lives there, and we know who the owner is, how big their property portfolio is, and sort of what the characteristics are of the tenants. And we're going to use all of that to identify sort of what are the possible mechanisms behind the key finding. Now, this is the most technical slide, and I'm just going to give you the intuition. So those that like math, they can read the math, but the intuition is very simple. Why can properties differ in returns, right? Well, it needs to be that what is priced in the rental market is different from what is priced in the sale market, right? Maybe an additional square meter gives you a 1% higher price in the rental market, but only a 0.5% higher price in the sale market. And maybe a location is priced very well in the sale market, but the location is actually not so expensive in the rental market. And that can lead to difference between the rent price and the sales price in the ratio between the two of them. Now, measuring that is very complicated, and I think one of the reasons why it is complicated is actually the same problem we have in rent control. So if you have a reference price, right, the question is always, is the reference price mismeasured, or is the real price of the rent too high? And you have the same here. Like, we want to classify properties from low tier to high tier. We need to say, is our measure of the expected rental value of the property correct, or might it be measured with error? This is not going to drive our results. And so that's the key intuition here. Now, I'm going to show you here some numbers. What you need to think is D1 is the bottom 10% of properties in terms of rental value. D10 is the top 10%. Now, the first thing what you need to know is the gross yield is the annual rent divided by the sales price, which is the actual sales price in Belgium, the estimated one in the Netherlands. We also link now to actual sales prices. And what you see, sort of both in Belgium and the Netherlands, the yield is about 6 to 7%. For the bottom properties, it's 4% for the top properties. Now, why is that so big? Well, one part is actually the costs of operating the units. They sort of are much higher relative to the value in the low tiers, because the maintenance is relatively higher. I think the same thing, for example, the likelihood of tenant default is higher. We all measure this sort of with registry data and some back of the envelope estimates. And management plays a role too, right? Because managing a property, an expensive property, is not really more expensive than managing a low tier property, and which means that this fixed cost is going to be much higher. But even after you adjust all of that, there remains a difference, right? It's about 1% per year in yields. If you think about how this is in terms of rent, this means, right, that sort of a bottom tier property and a top tier property, this difference is still something like 30%, right? So it means actually relatively the rental prices are the highest for the cheapest units. And so I showed you this already. We do that for all countries. I give you here the numbers also for the US. And the thing is also true that actually in realized returns, low tier properties, it's not that they have been really depreciating. Actually, if we look at properties that are sold repeatedly, they have higher capital gains. So also if you buy them and you sell them 10 years later, you make more return. It's not just that you earn more from the rents. Now, why is this the case, right? And I'm going to focus on regulatory risk, and for the sake of time, I'm going to skip the other two. But the intuition that many economists have is, insurance is something that we pay for, right? So insurance is something that we pay for. So we like investments that do well in bad times, because that's sort of an insurance. And investments that do bad in bad times, we don't like, So what do we want? We want extra return. Now, actually, low-tier rental property works the other way around. In crisis times, people try to scale back their housing consumption. The low-tier units, they are the smallest and cheapest units in the market. So we see consistently in the data that actually in a crisis, relatively the rent prices of low-tier units go up, very simply because people, they get laid off, they reduce income, they need to move to smaller housing, and that is the low tier. So that actually increases demand for the worst units. And so actually, this cannot explain why the return is higher. If anything, it makes the puzzle even bigger. Two, I'm going to tell you quite a bit about because we look at regulatory risk. The other thing that we're going to see is I'm going to look sort of at property level risk. If there's a lot of small landlords, they want to be compensated for risks they have. Now, regulatory risk, I think any investor we talk to said, no, these properties are so risky, the government will come in, they want to lower the rent, they want to give these tenants protections. That makes it so risky that we want higher returns. That's what a lot of investors tell to us. And it is not true. So what we've done many things. I'm going to focus on these two. In the United States, we used AI, multiple models, to determine by state how strong tenant protections are. And then we can rank states by being strongly protected versus weakly protected. And if states that are strongly protected would really be the ones that sort of have more risk because maybe they do even more regulations, you would expect the slope to be very strong in those states. That's not true. Like the very regulated states in the US, if anything, they have on average lower returns. And it's not really the case that there is anything more of a slope than in the not so regulated states. And that's actually, I think, because mostly expensive regions put in tenant protections, and actually expensive regions tend to have lower returns. I'm going to focus on the Netherlands because this came by, I think, in yesterday's presentation. In the Netherlands, there is a point system that determines for any property sort of a reference rental price. In our sample period, this is not really applied broadly, and it's also not binding. So in practice, in the private rental market in the Netherlands, even though there's on paper broad rent controls, nearly everyone was just charging market rate. But obviously there was the risk, and it actually materialized a year ago, that they would make this binding and that the rents would have to go down. So what we did, we classified by region, regions where if rent controls would be binding, you would lose a lot of money. Those are the red regions. And if you look at the red regions, actually the slope is less. So it means that actually in the regions where you lose a lot of money when rent control is enforced, you do not really see a big difference between low tier and high tier. So it cannot really explain why. And just because we're at a rent control conference, I just want to tell you a little bit sort of what I used this research for, because after I did this research, the Dutch government, the minister asked me, like, can you write a report because you have data on the returns of all properties, and you can estimate these reference rents. So I will tell you a bit about Dutch rent controls. It used to be the case that the red bars were properties that, based on the points for the rooms, the kitchen, they were already regulated before the law passed in our sample period. If they would be regulated, the maximum price would be here. This is the difference between the market rate and the regulated rate. If it's negative, it's fine. You pay less than the maximum reference price, so that's fine. If it's higher, you actually pay more than the reference rent. Before rent control was deemed binding, tenants had to fight themselves to go to a rent committee to get the lower rent. Well, no one did this. What you see actually in the already regulated segment, on average, the difference between the regulated price and the market price was biggest, and actually a lot of these units were way too expensive according to the reference price system. Now they expanded the reference price to the light blue bars or the purple bars, and now it's deemed binding and you actually get fines. And so this is actually very severe because you see a lot of properties that have to go down like more than 50% in rent because they're 100% too expensive right now. And the market is now crazy. This is just to see like where does rent control bind? Well, mostly in Amsterdam. This is Amsterdam. But you can see sort of where are returns the lowest in the Netherlands. It is also in Amsterdam. So these are the yields. You see actually in low income areas, the yields are high, but rent control is not really binding. In the expensive areas, rent is obviously very high, but sales prices are even higher. So the returns to investing in these units are even lower. Which means that if if you ask landlords to ask less rent, they're probably going to sell the units, and that's what they're doing now at the mass scale. Is it true that it's really riskier if you invest in a single unit? Yes, there is some evidence for it. Because, for example, the likelihood of non-payment is higher. We see, and maybe these low-tier rental units have more expense risk, but it cannot really explain it, because what we see in the Netherlands is that actually a lot of the landlords in the low tiers, they're actually quite big. And we see this too in the US. In the Netherlands, the very big ones that own over 1,000 units, they actually, like the pension funds, they only buy fancy housing. But sort of the medium-sized landlord with like a few hundred units, they are mostly active in the low-tier segment. In Belgium, you only have small landlords. But if anything, the slightly less small landlords, they're more active in the low tiers. And actually, people that only own 1 or 2 units, they're also not really active in the low tiers, mostly because these are formerly owner-occupied homes, and they tend to be expensive. And so that makes it very difficult, because a landlord that has a few hundred units, why would it care about, like, on average, having a few renters not paying the rent or causing it a headache? So what we think is going on, first of all, is that low-tier renters, they cannot move up or buy. And we see that in the data, simply because they cannot get a mortgage. I think that makes a lot of sense. The other thing that we show is that actually the big capital, they do not want to be perceived as the slumlords active in the low tiers. So they're actively shying away. They think it's very risky, even though we show it's less. And it might also be that it's very difficult to do low-tier investments at a very large scale, so that you have higher costs. And the final thing is that those that are active in the market, they have a hard time to attract additional capital. And so what we see is that actually in regions where there is a lot of low-income people that need low-tier rental housing, but very few local landlords, you see, let me show it here. So these are areas with a lot of low-tier rental housing. These are areas with very few low-tier rental housing. This is Amsterdam, the dot. There is no slope in Amsterdam. Amsterdam has a lot of wealthy people and has a lot of big investors. They also invest in the low tiers. But the wealthy investors in Amsterdam, they do not sort of invest in the low-income areas in the Netherlands. The people that invest in the low-income areas in the Netherlands are people that live in those areas. But there's very few landlords in those areas, so you're going to have very high rents and low sales prices. And so that sort of wraps it up, I think. I think it's ultimately sort of a limit to arbitrage story. There are frictions, and I think the problem is ultimately, yes, there is a lot of capital, but it doesn't always flow to where it's most needed, which ultimately leads tenants to pay a high price and landlords that are investing to make higher returns. And I guess we can have a good discussion about what to do about it, whether it's rent control or something else, but I leave that for now. Thank you.